to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Chapter 3, The Lone Islands. So let's first look at the map here. So we've got the Lone Islands, we've got Doorn, Avra, this is Avra, and Veltmuth. So, Chapter 3, The Lone Islands. Land in sight, shouted a man in the bows. Lucy, who'd been talking to Rince on the poop, came pattering down the ladder and raced forward. As she went, she joined Edmund, and they found Caspian, Drinian, and Reepicheep already in the forecastle. It was a coldish morning, and the sky was very pale, and the sea a very dark blue with little white caps of foam. And there, a little way off on the starboard bow, was the nearest of the Lone Islands, Felamath, like a low green hill on the sea, and behind it, further off, the gray slopes of its sister Doorn. Same old Felamath, same old Doorn, said Lucy, clapping her hands. Oh, Edmund, how long it is since you and I saw them last. I never understood why they belonged to Narnia, said Caspian. Did Peter the High King conquer them? Oh, no, said Edmund. They were Narnian before our time, in the days of the White Witch. By the way, I have never yet heard how these remote islands became attached to the crown of Narnia. If I ever do, and if the story is at all interesting, I may put it in some other book. Are we to put in there, sire? Said Drinian. I shouldn't think it would be very much good landing on Felamath, said Edmund. It's almost uninhabited in our days, and it looks as if it's the same still. The people mostly live in Doorn and on Little Arva. That's the third one, if you can't see it yet. They only keep sheep on Felamath. Then we'll double that cape, I suppose, said Drinian, and the land of Doorn. That means rowing. I'm sorry we're not landing on Felamath, said Lucy. I'd like to walk there again. It was so lovely. A nice kind of loneliness, with all grass and clover and soft sea air. I'd love to stretch my legs too, said Caspian. I'll tell you what. Why shouldn't we go ashore in the boat and send it back, and we could walk across Felamath and let the Dawn Treader pick us up on the other side? If Caspian had been as experienced as he became later in the voyage, he would not have made this suggestion, but at the moment it seemed like an excellent one. Oh, do let's, said Lucy. You'll come, will you? Said Caspian to Eustace, who'd come on deck with his hand bandage. Anything to get off this blasted boat, said Eustace. Blasted, said Drinian. How do you mean? In a civilized country like where I come from, said Eustace, the ships are so big that when you're inside, you don't know you're at sea at all. In that case, you might as well stay ashore, said Caspian. Will you tell him to lower the boat, Drinian? The king, the mouse, the two Pevensies, and Eustace all got in the boat, and they were pulled off to the beach of Felamath. When the boat left them and was being rowed back, they all turned and looked around. They were surprised to see how small the Dawn Treader looked. Lucy, of course, barefoot, having kicked off her shoes while swimming, but it was no hardship if one was going to walk on downy turf. It was delightful to be ashore again and to smell the earth and the grass, even if at first the ground seemed to be pitching up and down like a ship, as it usually does for a while when one has been at sea. It was much warmer here than it had been on board, and Lucy found the sand pleasant to her feet as they crossed it. There was a lark singing. They struck inland and up a fairly steep, though low, hill, and on top, of course, they looked back, and there was the Dawn Treader, shining like a great bright insect and crawling slowly northward with her oars. Then they went over the ridge and could see her no longer. Huxley, come here. You don't need to do that. Good boy. Doorn now lay before them, dividing Felamath by the sea, about a mile wide, and down to the left lay Arva. The little white town of Narrow Haven on Doorn was easily seen. Hello, what's this? Said Edmund suddenly. In the green valley, to which they had all descended, 6 or 7 rough-looking men, all armed, were sitting by a tree. Here are the men sitting by the tree. Don't tell them who we are, said Caspian. And pray, your majesty, why not, said Reepicheep, who had consented to ride on Lucy's shoulder. It's just occurred to me, replied Caspian, that no one can have heard from Narnia for a long time, and it's possible that they may not still acknowledge our overlordship, in which case they might not be quite safe to be known as the king. We have our swords, sire, said Reepicheep. Yes, Reep, I know we have, said Caspian, but if it's a question of reconquering the 3 islands, I'd prefer to come back with a rather larger army. By this time they were quite close to the strangers, one of whom, a big black-haired fellow, shouted out, "A good morning to you!" "And a good morning to you," said Caspian. "Is there still a governor of the Lone Islands?" "To be sure there is," said the man, "Governor Gumpus. His sufficiency is at Narrowhaven, but you'll stay and drink with us." Caspian thanked him, though neither he nor the others much liked the look of their new acquaintances, and all of them sat down. But hardly had they raised their cups to their lips when the black-haired man nodded at his companions, and quick as lightning, all 5 visitors found themselves wrapped in strong arms. There was a moment's struggle, but all the advantage were on one side, and soon everyone was disarmed and had their hands tied behind their back, except for Reepicheep, writhing in his captor's grip and biting furiously. "Careful with that beast, Tax," said the leader. "Don't damage him. He'll fetch the best price of the lot, I shouldn't wonder." "Coward! Poltroon!" squeaked Reepicheep. "Give me my sword and free my paws, if you dare." "Whew!" whistled the slave merchant, for that is what he was. "It can talk! Well, I did never. Blowed if I could take less than 200 crescents for him." The Collarman crescent, which is a chief coin in those parts, is worth about 1/3 of a pound. "So that's what you are," said Caspian, "a kidnapper and a slaver. I hope you're proud of it." Now, said the slaver. "Don't you start with any jaw. The easier you take it, the pleasanter all round. I don't do this for fun. I've got my living to make, same as anyone else." "Where will you take us?" asked Lucy, getting the words out with some difficulty. "Over to Narrowhaven," said the slaver, "for market day tomorrow." "Is the British Council there?" said Eustace. "Is there a witch?" said the man. Before long, Eustace was tired of trying to explain. The slaver simply said, "Well, I've had enough jabber. The mouse is a fair treat, but this one could talk the hind legs off a donkey. Off we go, mates." Then the 4 human prisoners were roped together, not cruelly, but securely, and made to march down the shore. Reepicheep was carried, and he had stopped biting on threat of having his mouth tied up, but he had a great deal to say, and Lucy really wondered how any man could bear to have things said to him which were being said to the slave dealer by the mouse. But the slave dealer, far from objecting, only said, "Go on," whenever Reepicheep paused for breath, occasionally adding, "It's as good as a play," or "Blimey, you can't help thinking it almost knows what it's saying," or "Was it one of you that trained it?" This so infuriated Reepicheep that in the end a number of things he was saying all at once nearly suffocated him, and he became silent. Here's everybody marching, tied together, on their way to the slave market. When they got down to the shore and looked towards Doorn, they found a little village and a longboat on the beach, and lying on it, a little further out, a dirty, bedraggled-looking ship. "Now, youngsters," said the slave dealer, "let's have no fuss, and you'll have nothing to cry about. All aboard!" At that moment, a fine-looking, bearded man came out of one of the houses, an inn, I think, and said, "Well, Pug, more of your usual wares?" The slaver, whose name seemed to be Pug, bowed very low and said, "Yes, please, your lordship." "How much do you want for that boy?" said the other, pointing at the Caspian. "Ah," said Pug, "I knew your lordship would pick the best. No deceiving your lordship with anything second-rate. That boy now, I've taken a fancy to himself, gotten kind of fond of him. I have, and I'm tender-hearted. I don't ever think I ought to have taken up this job. Still, for a customer like your lordship—" "Tell me your price, carrion," said the lord sternly. "Do you think I want to listen to the rigmarole of you filthy traders?" 300 crescents, my lord, to your honorable lordship, but to anyone else, I'll give you 150. Oh, please, please don't separate us, whatever you do. You don't know. But then she stopped when she saw Caspian didn't even want to be known. 150 then, said the lord. And as for you, little maiden, I'm sorry I cannot buy you at all. Unrope the boy, Pug, and look, treat these others well while they're in your hands, or it'll be worse for you. Well, said Pug, now who ever heard of a gentleman in my business who has treated his stock better than I do? Well, why, I treat him like my own children. Well, that's likely enough to be true, said the other grimly. The dreaded moment had now come. Caspian was untied, and his new master said, "This way, lad." And Lucy burst into tears, and Edmund looked very blank. But Caspian looked over his shoulder and said, "Cheer up. I'm sure it'll all come right in the end. So long." "Now, missy," said Pug, "don't you start taking and spoiling your looks for the market tomorrow. You be a good girl, and you won't have nothing to cry about. See?" And they were rowed out to the slave ship and taken below to the long, dark place, none too clean. And there they found many other unfortunate prisoners, for Pug, of course, was a pirate and had just returned from cruising among the islands, capturing what he could. The children didn't meet anyone whom they knew. The prisoners were mostly Galmians and Terebithians, and they sat upon straw and wondered what happened to Caspian, and tried to stop Eustace talking to everyone as if everyone except himself were to blame. Meanwhile, Caspian was having a much more interesting time. The man who bought him led him down to the little lane between the village houses and out into an open space behind the village. He turned and faced him. "You needn't be afraid of me, boy," he said. "I'll treat you well. I bought you for your face. You reminded me of someone." "May I ask whom, my lord?" said Caspian. "You remind me of my master, King Caspian of Narnia." Then Caspian decided to risk everything on one stroke. "My lord, I am your master. I am Caspian, King of Narnia." "You make very free," said the other. How shall I know it's true?" "Firstly, by my face," said Caspian. "Secondly, because I know within 6 guesses of who you are. You are one of the 7 lords of Narnia whom my uncle Miraz sent to sea, and on whom I've come to look for. Argos, Byrne, Octasian, Remnimar, Mavramorn, or I've forgotten the others. And finally, if your lordship will give me a sword, I can prove on any man's body is clean. I will prove on any man's body in clean battle that I am Caspian, son of Caspian, lawful king of Narnia, lord of Cair Paravel, emperor of the Lone Islands." "By heaven!" exclaimed the man. It is his father's very voice and trick of speech. "My liege, your majesty." And there in the field he knelt and kissed the king's hand. "The moneys your lordship disbursed for our person is made good from our own treasury," said Caspian. "They're not in Pug's purse yet, sire," said Lord Byrne, for he was, and never will be, I trust. "I have moved his sufficiency, the governor, to 100 times to crush that vile traffic in man's flesh." "My Lord Byrne, we must talk of the state of the islands, but first, what is your lordship's own story?" "Short enough, sire. I came thus far with the 6 fellows and loved a girl of the islands, and felt as though I had had enough of the sea. And there was no purpose in returning to Narnia while your majesty's uncle held the reins, so I married and have lived here ever since." "And what is this governor, this Gumpus, like? Does he acknowledge the king of Narnia for his lord?" "In words, yes. All is done in the king's name. But he would not be best pleased to find the real live king of Narnia come upon him. And if your majesty came before him alone and unarmed, well, he would not deny his allegiance, but he would pretend to disbelieve you. Your grace's life would be in danger. What following has your majesty in these waters?" "There is my ship just rounding the point," said Caspian. "We are about 30 swords if it came to fighting. Since we have not my ship in and fall upon Pug and free my friends whom he holds captive." "Not by my counsel," said Byrne. "As soon as there's a fight, 2 or 3 ships would pull out from Narrow Haven to rescue Pug. Your Majesty must show more power than you really have, and by the terror of the king's name, it must not come to plain battle. Gumpus is a chicken-hearted man and can be overawed. After a little more conversation, Caspian and Byrne walked down the coast a little west of the village, and there Caspian winded his horn. This is not the great magic horn of Narnia, Queen Susan's horn. He had left it home for his regent Trumpkin to use it if any great need fell upon the land in the king's absence. Drinian, who was on lookout for the signal, recognized the royal horn at once, and the Dawn Treader began standing into shore. The boat put off again, and in a few moments Caspian and Lord Byrne were on deck explaining the situation to Drinian. He, just like Caspian, wanted to lay the Dawn Treader along the slave ship at once and board her, but Byrne made the same objection. "Steer straight down the channel, Captain," said Byrne, "and then round Arvo where my own estates are. But first, run up the king's banner, hang out all the shields, and send as many men to the fighting top as you can. And about 5 bow shots hence, you shall get to the open sea on the port, and again run up a few signals." "Signals? To whom?" said Drinian. "Why, to all the other ships we haven't got, but which might be well that Gumpus thinks we have." "Oh, I see," said Drinian, rubbing his hands. "And they'll read our signals, and what shall I say? 'Whole fleet round the south of Arva and assemble at Burnstead,'" said Lord Byrne. "That'll do excellently. Their whole journey, if there were any ships, would be out of sight in Narrow Haven." Caspian was sorry for the others languishing in the hold of Pug's slave ship, but he could not help finding the rest of the day enjoyable. Late in the afternoon, for they had to do all by oar, having turned to the starboard and rounded the northeast end of Dorne and poured again around the point of Arva, they entered the good harbor on Arva's south-ended shore where Byrne's pleasant land sloped down to the water. Byrne's people, many of whom they saw working in the fields, were all freemen, and it was a happy and prosperous fief. Here they all went ashore and were royally feasted in a low-pillared house overlooking the bay. Byrne and his gracious wife and merry daughters made them good cheer, and after dark Byrne sent a messenger over by boat to Dorne in order to make some preparations. He did not say exactly what for the following day. Here's the boat sending up messages